Good morning, everyone. There are many things common between saints of East and West, and one striking similarity that I'm sure all of us notice is that the lives of saints are filled with trials, tests, some may call suffering. In the West, almost it's considered a virtue, that suffering is somehow an indication of saintliness. But nonetheless, there is always drama, there's something happening in their lives, in all our lives, but certainly in the stories of saints that we hear, starting from, the early saints that were thrown to lions to be eaten, or, St. Francis of Assisi, or Bernadette, or St. Teresa of Avila, all of them have striking stories. And also in the East, suffering may not be glorified in the same way, but at the same time, the stories are similar. Mirabai was ostracized by her family and was ridiculed by society. Even recent saints like Ramana Maharishi had one of the worst forms of bone cancer. Ramakrishna had this huge cancerous tumor in his throat. Now, my dear friend Keshava, who's a gifted playwright, would tell me that for something to be called a story, there has to be a trajectory, that there is a character arc of evolution, growth, highs, lows. There has to be drama for something to be considered a story worth telling. And it's not just true with the saints. Of course, it's much more educational for us in their lives. But even all of our lives have a lot of stories. Tests are an integral part of what we experience in our day-to-day life. And Yogananda, the word that caught my eye was how Martin Luther tried to summarily dismiss Satan. I felt sometimes when you read the writings of Yogananda in the Whispers, I almost feel like he summarily dismisses tests. He writes a lot about them. I was reading something yesterday where he says, tests are not given to us to suffer. They're given to us to bring us closer to God. Makes a lot of sense, and it rings true, but at the same time, when we go through them, the experience is much more imminent. It doesn't seem all that easy or natural. Somehow, it just feels like it is designed for me to suffer. If we were to just take a step back, even in our own lives, I'm looking at the room, I know most of you are, at least, perhaps all of you, but at least most of you. We all have stories, and you think about your own life and all the different highs and lows, and I don't know if I would use the word tests, but certainly I can think of unpleasant experiences, unwelcome outcomes, however you want to call them. And we look back, and one thing perhaps is common, especially if you're here this morning, is that when we look back, we realize that those were moments that helped us grow, that helped us become who we are, that made us stronger. But that's not what's surprising or astonishing. But what I find surprising even more than that is, despite all of this counsel and despite knowing from our own life experience that they're meant to help us grow, we still resist. There is this inherent tendency in us to resist that which is unwelcome, that we don't prefer, that which is uncomfortable. My wife and I, we have 2 cat children. I may have mentioned them here before. They're a big part of my life, and they're old. And one of them is over 15, another is 13, and the older one is starting to have seizures, and there's this medication. If we see some symptoms, you have to give this medication, and it's a whole ordeal. And, she is a very intelligent cat. She loves us, she trusts us, but she really doesn't want the medication. In fact, I tried a drop of it to see how horrible could this be, and it was pretty horrible. So she resists it with all of her might. She's this tiny cat. She's not like, she doesn't have a lot of spunk, but still she will resist it with all her will. And, my wife uses a dropper and opens the mouth and gets it all in. And we noticed, a couple of times, she sort of like accepts it and walks away. And I was pretty surprised. And then I noticed she just walks away as soon as she's out of sight. She's still holding it in her mouth, and she spits it all out. She is so committed to not having that medication And then my wife had to start using a glass of water and a dropper and then hold her head in this position and then use 4 or 5 droppers full of water to sort of make her drink and then get it all in. It's a big ordeal, and she still hates it, the cat. But anyway, but it's a funny story, and you can totally relate to that. But also, it's not all that funny when we realize it's kind of what happens in our life as well. This resistance that's almost innate, instinctive in us when something that's happening is not what we want, what we expect, what's comfortable. Every part of our being, body, mind, soul, starts to resist, despite the fact that we have enormous resilience. Each one of us has gone through whatever life struggles or tests or anything which has brought us here, which has actually given us strength and growth and evolution and all of that. And still, we continue to do that because it is not often all that easy to accept. And I've been thinking and meditating on this idea of acceptance. Many years ago, I was in a seclusion at meditation retreat, and I was sitting with some situation in my life. It was not all that dire, but I just felt stuck. I didn't know how I could overcome what lesson I was meant to learn was somehow not all that obvious to me, and I decided that's a great case study for a seclusion, and I started to meditate. And the prayer that came to my mind was what's called the serenity prayer. Some of you may know this. I don't know where it's from. It's from some Christian mystic at some point, and I think it's used even in the Alcoholics Anonymous system. I read it somewhere, and it resonated with me the first time I read it. And I started using that prayer in my own meditation. If you don't know what it is, it's very simple. Lord, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's a very powerful prayer, and one that I could tune in to. And I started using this in my meditation, and I even started doing this on my mala and my walks. I would just say this prayer, just trying to figure out lessons that were coming up for me, but they were not all that clear. And when you have that kind of time and you're able to get still as the water starts to clarify, it started clarifying in my mind as well as the prayer was helping me go deeper. It was quite expansive. It was almost joyful in a certain way. And what came to me strongly in that situation, but then I started looking at every situation in my life, was it was not one or the other. You need all three at all times. There were parts of that situation that I needed to accept. There were parts of it that required change, and I certainly needed a lot more wisdom. But all of it was going to work together in some way. I don't think it's ever one or the other. In order to change something, you first have to accept it. And sometimes, in order to accept a life situation that's hard, it requires that we change something inside. We change some perspective, some notion, something that we are holding on to, without which we won't be able to accept. And the most important, of course, of all of this is the wisdom. And I was thinking about it, and somehow in the last couple of days, because of this reading, it came back to my mind, what does it mean to have that wisdom? And, it is not all that mysterious. The first thought that came to my mind was, if we even consider something a test, whether or not it is one, it's very subjective. What seems like a test to somebody, we always know all the answers to everybody else's problems. That's just a given. You look at somebody and you just know what lesson they need to learn, but it's not always all that obvious when it comes to our own lives. And when we even call something a test, it is implied already that there is an emotional response. There is something unresolved in our own hearts that is causing us to suffer in some way, mild, intense, again, very subjective, but even that unrest is caused because of some emotional response we have within us. And in order to even tap into that wisdom, it is important that we are able to detach or at least objectively look at that emotional response, without which that clarity is impossible. And thankfully, I was reminded of a time where my seclusion allowed me to do that. But no matter whether you have that kind of time or not, whether you are able to meditate for hours, but the wisdom is something that is born out of that stillness, that intuitive clarity that comes when we are even momentarily able to step away from that reactive process, from that emotional response that is making us perceive something as a challenge, something as a test. And from there, we get to watch, and it almost becomes somewhat self-evident what the acceptance is, what the resistance is, and what the change is. And sometimes the emotional response is bigger than our capacity for stillness. And that is not all that uncommon either. And in those times, all we need is openness and surrender. And this reading was one of, I think, the longest readings in Race of One Light. I was waiting and reading it even yesterday. There's a lot that Swami Kriyananda shares there. And during those times, sometimes all that we have to practice is patience, because we have to wait it out and we have to see how much can I learn, can I grow, how much can I keep opening and surrendering to whatever it is that is happening in my life. That image that the Bhagavad Gita verse presents is so timeless and so powerful. You know, the smoke that is obscuring the fire, the rust obscuring the mirror, and the baby in the womb. It's obviously talking about different kinds of karma. The smoke and the fire, you don't have to worry about it. It'll be fine. Once as you spiritually grow, it'll not be an issue at all. The rust on the mirror, that's change. You got to apply some muscle. It's not going to go away on its own. You have to work on it constantly. And then the last one is even scarier, baby in the womb. It's not going to come out in 8 months. It's not going to wait till 10 months. It's going to come out when it comes out. And you don't know what its term is. You just have to have faith and trust and keep at it. But even more subtle and powerful is the image, because the Gita doesn't refer to this as karma. It doesn't refer to it as tests. It says the self is obscured like the smoke obscuring the fire being obscured by the smoke, or the rust obscuring the mirror. And that verse itself has part of the answer, or perhaps the highest answer for that question, because that wisdom, that stillness requires that we identify with the self that is not obscured. For us to have some connection to realize that this response, this test, is not the self-definition that I want to hold on to. Because that is the truth. And going back to saints, I feel one of the reasons they have a lot of drama in their lives, why their stories are so well written, is because they're trying to demonstrate to us. That is the common trait between all saints, because they identify with that self. Whether or not they philosophically talk about it, or just they demonstrate through their own life example, but they're constantly unaffected by whatever we might call suffering, or what we might find to be a test or a challenge. The great Saint Ramana Maharishi, who lived just in our recent times, in the last century, he had this huge cancerous tumor. He had bone cancer, and he became very still. When people would express sympathy for his suffering, he would just say, what is suffering? It's the body. I'm not the body. And that's how he spoke throughout his life. But he was very unaffected. He became grave. You read some of his quotations and sayings from the last year or two of his life when he was suffering from cancer. He did become pretty serious, but he was still totally unaffected. He went through a surgery. This must have been in the late 40s. He went through a surgery back then where he refused any kind of anesthesia. As they were operating on his bones, he had his eyes wide open. He didn't even close his eyes. And because he was not going to become unconscious even for a second. Ramakrishna, another, not even a saint, a great avatar, his example was slightly different, but the same. Ramakrishna used to cry in pain. And you wonder, isn't he an avatar? He would just go to doctors and cry to them, take this pain away, please do something. But then he had this huge tumor in his throat. But then when it was time to actually clean the tumor, those days, I'm going to assume they used alcohol or something like that as an antiseptic. I don't know. It's a gnarly image. I'm sorry about presenting this morning. I'm just realizing where I went with all of this. But he used to go into a state of samadhi. He was always motionless when people were touching him, working on him. And he was not just motionless. He was in joy. He was in ecstasy. They were demonstrating what they were identified with. The story of Bernadette, there's this beautiful movie that some of you may have seen. It's a very old black and white movie. I think Yogananda watched that movie, not sure. But again, it's very old, and Bernadette was this great Christian saint in the fairly recent, in the last 200 years, 100 years or so. And she had visions of Mother Mary. And she became a nun, and Mother Mary visited her throughout her life. She was constantly in communion with Divine Mother. And she joined a convent, she became a nun, and because of her elevated state and how she was always in this communion, everybody became jealous of her, especially the Mother Superior was so jealous of her. And she used to treat her really, really bad. And at one point, she just melted down in front of Bernadette, asking her, I've been doing this all my life. I've served every waking moment. I've scrubbed the floors. I have slept 6 hours a day, serving all the rest of the day, praying all the time. Even how many rosaries I've done, how many I do each day. Why did Divine Mother choose to come to you and not to me? And Bernadette's response was quite simple. She just said, I don't know. I just really don't know. But in her own journals, which were discovered after her passing, she writes, the more I'm humiliated, the more joy I feel. There was no sense of ego in her. She was seeing everything as coming from Divine Mother. Her sense of identity was so tied with her relationship with God, with Divine Mother, that none of what was happening even touched her. And for those of you that know the story, in the last days of her life, when people actually removed the blanket and they removed her robe and the doctors were treating her, they saw that. Sorry about the image again. I didn't realize I was going to share this story this morning, quite honestly. But she had cancer of the bone, tuberculosis of the bones, and her entire body was infected. And then the Mother Superior realized the penance that Bernadette had been doing, not even sharing it with anyone. And then right before her death, she prayed and asked for her forgiveness, for all the ways in which she had treated her. Now, quite apart from all those gruesome stories, I think I warned you because I told you there is always drama in the lives of saints. But I think the most important demonstration is what they share with us is that there is always the possibility to transcend everything. The examples are played out in much more colorful scenarios, but even whatever it is that we face in our lives, something, mean somebody told us, or some situation that's not going the way we want it to go, all of that, we have the potential to transcend the emotional response. We have the potential to connect with God. I'll end with this one last thought because we are going to have a beautiful discipleship ceremony this morning, so I'll end a little sooner. Every test, whatever it may be, every perception of test is nothing but a test of our love for God. And that's all we need to remember and realize, that all that life is presenting to us is just that one test. How much do I love God? And every situation in life, all that we go through, every circumstance, every relationship, every person we meet, everything that happens is so impeccably curated to remind us all the ways in which we are not perfect yet, all the ways in which our love for God is not perfect yet. And it happens not because of any reason except that our souls want it, because we want to grow, we want to be bigger. For those of us in this room, because we ask for it, because we want God in our lives. So God reminds us, all the ways in which our love, our devotion is not perfect. And if we could only use those opportunities to come back to that, how do we face our tests? I don't know. The only thought that comes to my mind right now is to keep reminding ourselves that this is a test of love for God. And if I can go back there, if I can take my mind back to that point of reminding myself how much I love God, how that is the goal of my life, to open myself more fully, to surrender, to cultivate that devotion, then I get to identify more with that higher self, with that part of me that is untouched by all of this. Whatever that test may be, small, big, whether we call it suffering or not, we are so untouched by all of it when we start cultivating that other relationship, which becomes so much more real and fulfilling. God bless you.
Let's have a moment of silent meditation. And we'll have some music now.